Hey everyone, this is Forrest at The Complete Angler. Today we're going to do a little tying video for you. The fly that we're tying today is a hollow fly. This was created by Bob Popovics. It's a great fly for predatory fish. I especially use it for striped bass. It's going to be the same platform throughout, whether you have a larger 9-inch version, or your 6-inch version, down all the way to a 4-inch. I use a variety of sizes. I definitely like using it for a larger bait fish profile. Say I have adult bunker and I'm looking to match a larger fly. I like to tie it up to 9 inches. This is the largest. So we'll go over the materials that we need. Pretty basic with the materials. We're going to need some Flatwing Saddle for the tail. We're going to need some high quality bucktail. This is very important. We need a lot of length to our bucktail. Density of fibers, but we don't want to overdo it with this. We want to keep it nice and sparse. It's going to be easy to cast, especially with an 8 through 10 weight. And last but not least, we have some eyes and Peacock Herl. Peacock Herl just adds a little bit of dimension on the top, color transition to a darker back on that bait fish. So hope you guys enjoy. We'll get started. This particular hollow fly is going to consist of a couple different steps. First, we're going to tie in our tail material, a standard tie of bucktail, followed by our flatwing saddles. We're going to get our length that we want based on the length of flatwing saddle we're going to use in this fly. Next, it's going to consist of 3 reverse ties of bucktail. We're going to be tying in with the tips forward and using our pen tube to push them back. What that does is creates a larger profile. We can adjust the flare depending on how we want. We can tighten the flare, and then as we move forward, we can increase the amount of flare to get a nice teardrop profile for our bait fish. So let's get started. So we're going to start off our thread. For this particular fly, I like to use a .006 mono. That mono is nice and invisible. So we're going to advance our thread back to our first tie-in point. We're going to grab some bucktail. We're going to grab a nice long amount. We want it fairly sparse. This tail is essentially going to act as a little bit of profile, but more to solidify that wing. So it's going to act as a rigid section. That way you don't have fouling with your flatwing saddles around the hook. So I pulled off a nice long section of bucktail, not too many fibers. What I'm going to do is I'm going to clean it up. So I'm going to come forward, grab the tips of the bucktail, and we're stroking out any of the shorter under fibers. That's going to give us a consistent length on the tail, as well as use the best portions and the best fibers of the tail. So you can see we end up with a nice sparse amount. Now we're going to tie it in. This is going to be a standard tie. I'm going to do 2 loose wraps, 2 to 3. And I'm going to just spread that bucktail around the hook so I have nice even coverage. When I'm confident that all sides are covered, I'm going to tighten it up. Couple tight wraps to lock in our bucktail, and we're good. Now we can go to the flatwing saddle. I'm going to trim up our butt ends. So I'm going to be tying an olive and white hollow fly. I'm going to start out with our white saddle. This fly is going to come to about 9 inches total length. I'm going to start my white on my side, followed by one on this side. I try to keep the length the same on the tail on each of our flat wings. Next, I'm going to move to a transition color. This is a cream colored flat wing. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to tie one feather on each side, keeping the same length. We're going to trim our butts. Last but not least, it's going to be the olive. I'm going to tie that slightly on top of the cream and white to try to give it a nice transition color on the top of the fly. So this is how we get the length of what fly we want. If I wanted a smaller fly, I would just shorten up the length on my Flatwing saddle. I'm going to trim it up a bit, make sure everything's cinched down. And for a little extra security, I'm going to use some super glue. Okay, now that the tail's done, we're going to move on to our bucktail part. This is where we're going to do our hollow tie. So I'll go through the steps that we need to show you how to get that correct flare and taper to our fly, as well as the reverse tying process. So we're going to advance forward. About to 1/3 of the way up our shank. We're going to do one tie in here. Our second tie we're going to do here, followed by our last tie on the head. For this first tie, I just like to use the standard white, and then for the 2 consecutive ties after that, I'm going to do a 50-50. On the bottom, I'm going to use my white tail. On the top, the olive. I'd like to mention you can use a variety of hooks for this fly. The one hook I do like is the Gamakatsu SL12S. For the longer version, I like to use the 6/0. If I'm tying the 6-inch version, I'll use the 4/0. And then for my smaller 4-inch flies, I like to use the 2/0. So we have our section ready to reverse tie. Again, I want to go fairly sparse. I'm going to stroke out the under fibers. If we add too much material, it's actually going to kill the motion of this fly. and it's going to be a little bit tougher to cast. So now that I'm confident and it's nice and neat, I'm going to transfer it to my hand, and I'm going to tie it with the tips forward. So I'm going to start and grab it by the butt ends and do 2 loose wraps. Once I do my gathering wraps and I feel like I have a good control of the material, I'm going to transfer it. And I'm going to start to use my thumb and my forefinger and really spread it around the hook to get nice even coverage. One thing that I found out is you want nice even coverage on this fly. When you're reverse tying it, it comes out with a nicer looking reverse tie. Everything looks nice and neat, and it's not cockeyed to one way. I'm going to tighten everything up, and you can see the bucktail is starting to flare. I'll do 2 more tight wraps on it to make sure I have everything cinched down. And this is where you can trim your butt ends, kind of neaten everything up. Next, for this process, you can use a hair packer. I always like to use just the end of a pen tube. That works plenty fine. I'm going to distribute my bucktail and push it back. Once I'm confident that that looks good, I'm going to hold the bucktail down, and I'm going to advance my thread in front of the tie-in point in our bucktail. It's important that I come straight through the fibers instead of at an angle, because this can also cockeye your bucktail and it's not going to come out as nice. So I'm going to go straight forward, and I'm going to advance the thread in front of my bucktail. So during this process right now, what we're going to be doing is building a thread dam right here. That thread dam is going to either tighten up or loosen the amount of flare that we want. For this first tie-in point, I'm going to keep it fairly tighter together. So I'm going to give it a nice thread dam. What we want to do is build up that thread, and we don't want to jump onto the bucktail immediately. We're going to build a nice ramp, and that's going to make it easier to work with. One important thing too that makes it come out nicer is if I keep straight wraps. I don't want to wrap in an angle too drastically. That'll keep my flare consistent. So I like how that looks so far. If you needed to increase the amount of flare, you could always unwrap some of the thread dam, and that will spread the hair further out. For this one, I want to keep it relatively close together, and we're going to control the flare and flare it more as we come forward. Again, I always like to finish it off with super glue to make it more durable on the thread dam. Next, we're ready to advance to our next tie-in point. So now we are about 2/3 up the way of the hook. For the next reverse tie, we're going to put white on the bottom, and then we're going to start our olive at the top. So I'll show you an easy way how to control the bucktail being spread just on the bottom half of the hook. and then the olive on the top half of the hook. If you have a rotary vise, it will help to invert it. That way you can tie in your white a little bit easier. So I'm going to grab my white bucktail. Again, we're going to get rid of any of the under hair. And like the other hollow tie we did before, we're going to reverse it and tie it in tips forward. So I'm going to start again with my 2 loose gathering wraps. And right away I'm going to transfer hands. I'm going to apply a little bit of tension. Not too much to where it flares, but just so I can gather the material. Next I'm going to invert my hook. I'm going to spread it around on each side. I like to keep my thumb on top and avoid any errant fibers spinning around the hook to the top portion where we're going to be tying in our olive tail. And I want nice even coverage just on the underside of the hook. Once I'm confident that it's spread from this half on my side under the bottom to this half on the far side, then I can apply tension and lock it in, followed by 2 tight wraps. As you can see, we don't have any errant fibers that are straight to the top of the hook where I'm going to tie in my olive tail. We're going to clean up our olive. And do the same process, tying tips forward. Going to do 2 loose gathering wraps. Apply a slight amount of tension. We're going to manipulate it around the top half of the hook. If I have any errant fibers that want to travel past the halfway point, I can pinch and pull up together. That'll condense the fibers on the top. Once I'm confident I have even coverage on the top half of the hook, I'm going to apply a little more tension, followed by 2 more tight wraps. Now I'm ready to reverse my bucktail. I'm going to trim off the butt ends. I'm going to grab our pen tube. Push the fibers back. Grab onto the fibers. And again, we're going to come straight towards the eye of the hook to advance our thread and wrap in front. So for this next reverse tie, we're going to create our thread dam. but we're going to have a little bit more flare than the previous tie. And you want to build up that ramp of thread. That's especially important with the mono thread because it can be slippery, and if you don't build up a nice gradual dam, it'll tend to slip back down. We're going to check our flare. We have to do a couple more wraps. Don't want to apply too much tension with these nice loose wraps, just to control the degree of flare. So I'm liking the amount of flare it has right now. Don't worry about it being too perfect yet. What we're going to do is run this fly underwater, let it dry, and that helps you get this teardrop profile that we're looking for. Again, I'm going to apply a little super glue. We're going to advance our thread. This time our tying point is going to be right next to the hook eye for our final reverse tie. So one thing I'd like to mention is the versatility of this pattern. This is essentially a platform that we use to create a lot of different ideas, a lot of different materials that have different motion. For instance, if you wanted to incorporate flash in, now would be the time to do so right in front of this thread dam. We could tie flash in right here. Similarly, we could use ostrich, which would have a lot more motion. You can get as creative with this fly as you want. But for simplicity terms, we're just going to stick to the basic pattern and use bucktail. So we're going to repeat the same process. We're going to grab our white bucktail, clean it up. And we're going to be distributing this bucktail around the underside. And one thing I would like to mention at this time is I'm going to keep the butt ends and not trim them on this reverse tie. I like keeping the butt ends because it adds a little bit more density in the head, which creates more water push and more disturbance without getting excessively bulky with our materials. So I really want to manipulate those fibers around the lower half of the hook and avoid any fibers traveling up to the top half of our shank. And we're going to repeat the same step with our olive. want to get nice even coverage. Feeling pretty confident in that, so we can start our reversing process. A couple tight gathering wraps to cinch everything down, and we're going to go ahead and reverse the bucktail. I'm going to hold on to our bucktail after I reverse it. We're going to advance our thread forward, making sure not to trap any. And we're going to be tying our thread dam in front of this reverse tie. Again, we're working our way back and forth up to the bucktail, back down to create a nice gradual ramp. So as you can see with our reverse tie, we started with a tighter angle in the back, and we increase it going slightly forward to the final reverse tie. The next step that we have to do is run it under some water. What that's going to do is it's going to slim it down a little bit. It's going to create that teardrop profile once it dries. So in my end, I have about 10 fibers of strung Peacock Herl. This is the longer stuff. It's about 8 to 10 inches in length. And this is definitely necessary when you're tying some larger versions of this fly. So all we're going to do now is finish off the fly and tie it right on top. Again, you can use the same technique that we used to distribute the bucktail around the top of the hook using our thumb. So I'm going to measure my length. I like to come back to about an inch away from the back of the tail. Again, I'm going to use a couple loose wraps. Use my thumb to distribute my Peacock Herl around the top half of the hook. I'm just trying to create a nice color transition with a darker back that a lot of bait fish have. Once I'm confident in that coverage, I'm going to advance the thread up my thread dam to secure it off and cut away the butt ends. Now that our fly is finished, I'm going to do a couple whip finishes. Like before, I'm going to use a little bit of super glue. After my super glue is dried, I'm going to run it under warm water, and I'm going to let it dry. And we'll show you what that process looks like. So we had our fly drying in the vise, and as you can see, we have a nice wide teardrop profile that we're after. Now we're ready for the next and last step, which is adding on our eyes. I like to use the 3D big fish eyes in 10mm or 3/8 in silver, and to adhere that, I like to use some Zap Goo. I find the Zap Goo is really durable stuff when I'm adhering eyes. It tends not to fall off after a lot of use and after catching a couple fish. So we're just going to throw a little Zap Goo on each eye. When I'm adhering the eyes on, I try not to press them too hard to flatten up our profile. I still want a cylindrical shape. That way when it dries, you still have a 3D shape to the head. So we're going to let this sit for a couple hours. We'll let it cure up and it's ready to fish. Thank you so much for watching. We hope that helped you tackle this fly. If you have any questions, check out our online store at CompleteAnglerOnline.com or give us a call. We'll be happy to help you out, and happy fishing.